As you say, Alison Patrick. My link is with my father. He went out to India in 1928. He worked then, I think, for Sirocco Works. He had gone to Inst over here. I think he didn't make much of his education. He was a bit lazy at school, and he joined in Sirocco Works at 16 and became an engineer. And you probably know there were links with India and Sirocco Works, because the founder of Sirocco Works was very closely linked with some of the tea plantations out there. And Sir Samuel Davison, he was called, went out to India as a boy of 17 or 18 many years ago, and was a great innovator, an inventor. And he actually invented some of the drying machine, or all of the drying machines that were used in the industry. So that's where the Sirocco and the India link is.
Yes.
So my father was 24, and Belfast in 1928 was probably quite a grim place, I think.
Yeah.
He was the oldest of 6. His mother died when he was 14 or 15, and I think it sounded great. The opportunity to go to India was quite exciting.
Yeah.
It amazes me always because, in those days, nobody would have known what India was like. There was no internet, TV, and the photographs that they had would have been very simple things, so
yes.
It took quite a lot of bravery, I think, to say, yes, I will go to India.
Exactly.
So he did go, and he went. It took about 5 weeks, I think, in the ship. And long afterwards, when my mother died, I found that he had had a diary that he had kept, which you've seen, of his trip, which I think is very interesting. It's a kind of historical document, because it describes how they left and how he felt. And he'd never been further away than Manchester before, so you imagine what that was like.
Yeah.
And they went down the Bay of Biscay, and people were sick, but he wasn't. And then as they got further and further south, it got hotter and hotter, and they began to sleep out on deck. And the games that they played on board, I just thought it was fascinating. And going through the Red Sea, and then finally getting to India 5.5 weeks afterwards. They went up the river Hooghly, and I think that's the entrance to Calcutta, and he, I think, described very clearly the excitement of the people on board when they saw people they knew, etc. So he arrived there and went in a train, and presumably, he didn't say much about that, but the only way up north then, because he was going up to Assam, and that was now to the Moran Company. And I think the only way up would have been by train. They couldn't have flown in those days. And in those days, you only got home if you're a tea planter. Now, he went out as what was called an assistant engineer. That was his role.
Okay.
But basically, it was all about tea, as you can imagine.
Yes.
So they were only able to get home every 5 years. Which is amazing, really. Think of going away and knowing you're not going to get back for 5 years. Well, you can understand if it took 5 weeks to get home, maybe that was why. But I think they were treated not exactly harshly, but there weren't too many luxuries or not too much money spent on them, you know. So after 5 years, he came back on his first leave, and they got 6 months leave in 1933. And he was only a young man. He was born in 1904, so he was 28 in those days. He was quite young. So I think one of the purposes of them coming home for those leaves was to find themselves wives, I'm sure. And it did happen. There are numerous stories of planters coming home and meeting women and getting married and going back out again, in a short period of time. And there was one excellent story of one of the planters, I don't know which one it was, who was quite a sort of stiff kind of guy, and the only way he could find himself a wife was to sit outside a girls' school and pick one of them going in, and he went in and asked the headmistress if he could meet her, and he didn't marry her, actually. He did.
That's right, okay. That's one way to do it.
I don't know which one it was. I'm suspicious, but not quite sure what his name was. Anyway, that was what I did. So he didn't meet anybody out in 33. Back out to India again, and as I say, conditions were quite harsh, I think, and also healthcare was very poor. They would have got malaria, and they got dysentery, and there was typhoid, all sorts of things. Pretty grim, really.
Serious illnesses as well.
What? Sorry.
Serious illnesses.
Serious, yeah. He did have, dysentery, and even I think because you can carry that in you for a long time. He had various episodes of that throughout his life. And also later on, when he had a cold, he always thought he had a touch of malaria,
Right, okay.
And he had eye problems, so it was no picnic really, I think. So anyway, back out to India in 1933, 5 more years, came back in 1938. And just towards the end of the time, he'd 19 days to go until he was due to go back. They used to go out to India in October because that was the beginning of the cool season.
Okay.
So they would come home over the summer when it was hot out there, cooler here, and then go back out there. So he was due to go back out on 13th of October. And in September, he met my mother. 19 days before he went away. He was on holiday and he met her on holiday in Port Rush of all places.
Oh, right. A romance.
Yeah, and she had gone up there to help out a friend who was running something up there, some kind of B&B, and he said the first time he ever saw her, she had a hoover in her hand. My mother was a good cleaner, you know, so he thought this is very funny. So they began to go out with each other, and they must have fallen in love. And you know, when I think of my parents now, it is so out of character, really, because they seem to me to be terribly conservative Presbyterians, you know.
Okay.
But anyway, they must have fallen in love. He went and asked her father for her hand, and I'd love to have heard that conversation because father was quite a sort of stiff, shy man, you know, Anyway, the answer must have been yes because they got engaged. He went back out to India. He had to go back. It was in October, and the idea was that she would follow him out.
Yes.
However, it didn't happen because obviously the war came in '39, and also I think the main reason was her parents didn't want her to go.
Right. Okay.
I think that was the main reason, because as I say, it just was a bridge too far for them, you know, and she'd be very beaten to her parents.
Okay.
So he had booked her passages, as they called them, out on ships that she couldn't take up, and there were other people going to and fro. I mean, you know, the war didn't stop all of the traffic back and forth. I mean, there were women who actually did go out, but mother didn't go out. Well, the interesting thing to me is that they corresponded for the entire duration of the war, from 1938, end of 1938 to the beginning of 1946. So they'd known each other for 3 weeks, and they waited for 7 or 8 years before they got married.
That is romance.
So and then she kept all his letters, which again I only found after she died, and I went through them all, and believe me, it was tears were tripping me, you know, it really was, because I mean they were romantic letters at the start anyway, they were, which you just don't see your parents in that light really, I don't think. And then he got more disappointed, you could tell, you know, as time was going on, and at times he didn't know where she was. He'd booked her passages and she wasn't on the ship, all kinds of things. But he gives a bit of insight into life there. I mean, I think at the war times out there, it was different from here, because they weren't, you know, being bombed or anything, but it was the Japanese threat was the big issue. And tea planters, they had a volunteer force, a bit like sort of Dad's Army. Well, that's a bit crude, maybe. It was called the AVLH, the Assam Valley Light Horse. The picture of him here, actually. I don't know where he is in this, but there's a picture of the Assam Valley Light Horse there in 1934, I think. Okay. There you are.
That's fantastic. So he would have volunteered for this then?
Yes, I think they all did, because there's not much else to do, really.
Oh.
Well, life must have been pretty boring. I think it was work and nothing much else. So he must be in there somewhere. I can't pick him out, I have to say.
It's fantastic. The uniforms and everything.
Yes, and obviously rifles as well, you know, and he got hit in the eye with the rifle butt, and he got cataracts later on in life, he thinks, from that. But anyway, so where did it got to? Oh yes, that's right, the wartime. Quite a few of the planters would have joined up. You know, two of them. Yes, that's right. It was Sidney Hare and Pat Kirkwood. Sidney Hare joined the RAF and was killed, and Pat Kirkwood joined and served then in Malaya and was taken to Singapore, and followed Singapore, and was a prisoner of war. But my father stayed on, but there were fewer people working on the plantations then. I mean, there were very few British people working, so they had to work quite hard, as you can imagine. But one thing that's significant is the planters helped to build, there was a road built out of Burma to facilitate the exit of, assuming obviously British forces from Burma, you know, when the Japanese were moving over to the west. So he was pretty busy there on the Manipur Road. It was called MANIPUR, the Manipur Road, and quite a few planters would have helped to build that. And it meant there was 1 year, 1942, when he didn't correspond with him for 3 months because he was there. I mean, you know, that was happening. I think it was 1944 anyway. When I was going through his letters, I made a few notes of things that were significant, I thought. I think it was about then anyway. So, I mean, I think wartime was a bit strange there, and then they had they've had Americans, they had a base somewhere nearby, so Americans would have come over to the plantation, which was quite entertaining for them, you know. And some of the British forces as well. I had an uncle in the army in the Skillings, and he was in India at one point, but they were such a long way away they couldn't meet each other, you know, so it was strange, and I think also communications began to be quite slow, you know, letters to and from, but they continued writing on mother and father. The tea plantations, how can I describe them? There were times of the year when they were very, very busy, you know, very busy depending on the crops, and they'd have started work at 4 a.m. and that kind of thing, but there were other times of the year when they weren't very busy, and their free time, there was nothing for them to do really, the planters, so the only thing they did actually was play polo.
Right.
It's a big thing out there, polo, because it had started up there in Assam. That was the birthplace of polo. I think Manipur, was the birthplace of polo. So they all played polo and they all had horses, and they travelled around the tea estates on their horses. They called them ponies, but they were really horses, and they imported them in from Australia. So he when he went to India, he said he'd really not been on a horse before. He'd been on a horse on his grandfather's farm, an old farm horse.
A bit different.
So when he went out there, they said, "Bill, can you ride?" You know, well, I've been on a horse before. So he said that he got on the horse. Somebody hit the horse round the back end, a slap, and the horse took off at a gallop. And after that, he could ride. He said, but nobody taught him. They just got on and sort of went. And the centre of their activities was in a sort of club, I think, a polo club as it was called, but it was like a social club, and it's still there to this day because I've been at it. Entirely white, you know, no Indians in it at all. Okay, that's all changed, of course. So all of the planters would have socialised there, and they had teas and buns, and when my mother went out, she would have cooked for them and that sort of thing. So that was their social life. When there was just one night a week, I think they went to the club, and then the other nights they went to each other's homes or bungalows and would have had meals at each other's bungalows, and a wee bit of golf. There was a wee bit of golf here and there, but not very much. You know, it was pretty crude, I think. Really.
Yes.
So what else would you like to know about the work of the estate, really? He was there as an engineer, as I say, to support the Srocca works. Yes.
What would his day-to-day role have been then? Would he have been managing?
Yes, well, he became the manager of it. As an engineer, he would have been responsible for the machinery, obviously. So the Srocca machinery, and some of it's still there, it's still going strong. I've actually got photographs of it.
Oh my goodness.
In fact, I was in Malaysia a few years ago, and I saw some there, which was probably 100 years old. So it's built to last, you know.
Yeah, they did themselves out.
There were dryers, you know, they dried the leaf. Up to the invention of these machines, they were dried over charcoal, very primitive. Right. It's actually not a terribly complex process. Yeah. It's very simple. Pick it and dry it and chop it and pack it. You know, it's not a complicated process. It's not as complicated as making cigarettes, for instance. It's much easier than that. So his job would have been to be responsible for all the machinery, but he became manager then, which meant he'd been responsible for the whole garden. And usually they would have had 2 or 3 gardens in the company. I think that the Moran company, which he worked for, had a number of tea gardens. One was called Sepon, S-E-P-O-N. And each of the gardens was divided into different areas, like Anguri, Tikarai, Bataliban, they all had names, you know. So that would be, and then they'd be responsible also enough for the workers, you know, for providing their housing, etc., and paying them and all that sort of thing, and putting entertainments on for them and that kind of